My daughter blocked me from the delivery room when my first grandchild was born. 3 days later, she mailed me a bill for $87,000. I want you to sit with that for a second. I held that envelope in my hands for a long time before I opened it. I recognized her handwriting on the outside, the same loopy cursive I watched her learn at the kitchen table when she was 7 years old, the same hand I held in the waiting room when she got her tonsils out, the same hand that signed her college diploma while I stood in the bleachers and cried like I had no shame about it whatsoever. And inside that envelope was an itemized invoice, typed, professional, like something you'd get from a contractor. Line 1, hospital birth suite, premium package, $14,200. Line 2, postpartum night nurse, 8 weeks, $22,400. Line 3, nursery interior design and furniture, $18,750. Line 4, meal delivery service, 3 months, $47,600. Line 5, family support contribution, $27,704, $27. At the bottom, in her handwriting again, Dad, this is what family does. We expect payment within 30 days. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a regional operations manager for a logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. My wife Barbara passed from ovarian cancer 9 years ago. I raised our daughter Stephanie alone from the time she was 15. I paid for her college, all 4 years at Ohio State, room and board included. When she moved to Seattle with her boyfriend, I co-signed her first apartment lease because she didn't have enough rental history. When they got engaged, I quietly wired $15,000 to help with the wedding. No fanfare, no strings attached, because that's what Barbara would have wanted, and because I loved my daughter and I wanted her to be happy. His name is Theron. He comes from what I'd describe as a family with opinions about themselves. His father made money in commercial real estate in the 90s and never let anyone forget it. His mother, Gwendolyn, hosted a brunch the first time I visited Seattle and spent 45 minutes telling me about her charity board memberships while I sat there, nodding and eating a mini quiche. Theron himself worked in brand consulting, which, near as I could tell, meant he charged companies a lot of money to make their logos bigger and their taglines more aggressive. Stephanie met him at a work event. Within 6 months, she was different. Not in the way people change when they're happy. She'd always been a practical girl, straight-talking, knew the value of $1 because she'd watched me clip coupons after her mother's medical bills nearly cleared us out. This was different. She started using words like optics and curating our narrative. She stopped calling on Sundays. When I visited, Theron would glance at my rental car in their driveway with an expression I can only describe as pity. I told myself it was just adjustment. New relationship, new city, new life. I didn't want to be the overbearing father. Barbara used to say, give people room to grow into who they're becoming. So I gave room, maybe too much. The first sign I ignored was when they announced the pregnancy, and Gwendolyn immediately started talking about the birth plan as though she were the project manager. She flew to Seattle twice during the 3rd trimester. I offered to come help with whatever they needed, Stephanie said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I wrote it down. Dad, Gwendolyn has it handled. She knows how Theron likes things done. Theron likes things done. My daughter was 8 months pregnant, and her mother-in-law was managing the situation according to how her son preferred things. I let it go. 2 weeks before the due date, Stephanie called, which was unusual enough that I sat down before I answered. She told me they had decided on a close family-only policy for the hospital. I said that sounded reasonable. I'd book a hotel nearby and come as soon as the baby arrived. She went quiet for a moment, then said, Dad, we mean just Theron's family. His mom and his sister are going to be there. We need consistency in the space. Consistency in the space. I asked her to explain what that meant. She said Gwendolyn had a system for supporting Theron through stressful situations, and having too many people with different energy levels in the hospital would disrupt the process. I waited to see if she was going to laugh. She didn't. I told her I understood. I said it calmly. I wished her luck and told her I loved her, and I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for about an hour without moving. My wife and I had one child. One. We made that decision together because Barbara's first pregnancy had been complicated and her doctor advised caution. Stephanie was everything. She still is, even now, even after all of this. That's the part that nobody tells you about. Loving someone who is hurting you doesn't stop just because they're hurting you. My granddaughter was born on a Tuesday. I found out from a text message with 2 photos attached. She weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She had dark hair. Her name is Rosalind, which is a beautiful name, and I cried looking at those photos in a way I hadn't cried since Barbara's funeral. I booked a flight anyway. I called Stephanie and asked if I could come meet the baby, even for an afternoon. She said, and I want to be careful here to be fair to her. She sounded genuinely tired, genuinely overwhelmed. She said they needed a few weeks to settle into a routine and that Gwendolyn was staying through the end of the month to help. I asked if perhaps when Gwendolyn left, I could come then. She said she'd talked to Theron. She did not call back. 3 weeks later, the envelope arrived. I'll tell you what went through my mind first, which was that it was a mistake, some kind of administrative error, a bill meant for an insurance company that got forwarded to me somehow. Then I read the handwriting on the envelope again. Then I read the note at the bottom again. This is what family does. I called my friend Walt. We'd worked together for 20 years, and he's the kind of man who says exactly what he thinks with no packaging around it. I read him the invoice over the phone. There was a very long silence. Then he said, "Buddy, I need you to not do anything for 48 hours. I said, "Why 48 hours? He said, "Because in 48 hours you'll be slightly less angry and only half as likely to do something you'll regret." He was right. I sat on it for 2 days. I called my sister in Cincinnati. She'd never particularly warmed to Theron, but she's fair-minded and I wanted a second opinion. She listened to everything and then said, "The question isn't whether she has the nerve to send that bill. The question is why she thinks you'll pay it." That question stuck with me. Why did she think I'd pay it? The answer, when I let myself see it clearly, was that I always had. Not bills like this, obviously, but I had always shown up with my wallet open and my mouth shut. The $15,000 for the wedding, the co-signed lease, the tuition, the times I'd driven 11 hours from Columbus to Seattle because they needed help moving furniture. I had never once said no, and they had apparently mistaken that for a policy. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I also started doing some math that I probably should have done earlier. Theron's family had money. His father's real estate portfolio, by Theron's own account at various dinner conversations, was worth several $1,000,000. Gwendolyn had been at the hospital. Gwendolyn had managed the nursery setup according to Stephanie's own updates on social media, where I'd watched my daughter post photos of custom-painted accent walls and a crib that retailed for about $4,000. So the question that the invoice forced me to ask was, where was all of that family money when the bill came due? I did something then that I hadn't done since Barbara was sick, which was call a lawyer. Not to sue anyone, just to understand where I stood. My attorney, a sharp woman I'd used for estate planning, listened to everything and confirmed what I suspected. I had no legal obligation to pay a single line of that invoice. She also pointed out that 2 of the line items, the family support contribution in particular, were vague enough to potentially constitute fraudulent billing if I wanted to pursue it. I told her I didn't want to go that far, not yet. Then I wrote a letter, not an email, a letter handwritten, mail first class. I told Stephanie I had received her invoice. I told her I was not going to pay it. I told her that I had given her my whole heart and a significant portion of my savings over the course of her life, freely and without conditions, because I loved her and because her mother loved her, and because that's what parents do. I told her that what parents do not do is fund a lifestyle built by another family while being excluded from the moments that matter. I told her that until I was able to meet my granddaughter in person, and until she and I could sit down together, without Theron or Gwendolyn in the room, and have an honest conversation about what our relationship actually is, I would be making some changes. The monthly money transfers I'd been sending, nominally for household expenses, which had totaled over $2,000 a month for the past 2 years, would stop immediately. The college savings account I had opened for the baby, $22,000 I'd been quietly building since the pregnancy announcement, would be redirected to a trust I controlled, held for Rosalind until she was 25, accessible only to her directly. I told her I was not punishing her. I told her I was done being an ATM that got powered off whenever it was inconvenient. I said I loved her. I said I always would. And then I mailed it and went for a walk around my neighborhood for about an hour because my hands were shaking. The response came faster than I expected. 4 days, which told me she read it quickly and thought about it for 3 days before responding. She called, not wrote. Her voice was different than it had been, less managed, more like herself. She was upset, genuinely upset, and some of what she said was accusatory and unfair, and I let her say it. When she finished, I said, "Are you done?" She said yes. I said, "Okay, now I need you to hear me." I talked. She listened. It was the first real conversation we'd had in probably 2 years. She told me things I hadn't known. That Theron had been the one to suggest the invoice, that he had framed it as formalizing family contributions, and that she had gone along with it because she was exhausted and overwhelmed, and because Gwendolyn had told her it was normal in families with financial structure. She told me that Gwendolyn had also suggested that my exclusion from the hospital would simplify the energy, and that she had agreed without fully thinking through what that meant for me. I asked her directly, "Did you want me there?" She started crying. She said yes. I want to be careful about what I say next because this isn't a story about villains. My daughter made choices I disagree with. She let herself be managed by people who had no interest in protecting her relationship with me. But she's also a new mother who was scared and tired and surrounded by a family that operates on social hierarchy, and she was trying to survive in that environment. I understand it. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. What I don't understand, and what I told her I would not accept, was the invoice. That wasn't exhaustion. That wasn't fear. That was someone looking at me and calculating that I was worth more as a resource than as a father. We agreed to meet. I flew to Seattle. Theron was home when I arrived, and I want to give him credit. He shook my hand and made eye contact and did not immediately retreat to another room, which told me he'd been spoken to firmly about how this was going to go. We did not have a warm conversation. We had an honest one. I told him that I would have given anything to be part of this family, that I had tried to be, that the invoice had told me more clearly than anything else could have exactly what he thought of me, and that I intended to make decisions going forward with that information fully in mind. He said he thought I would appreciate contributing in a tangible way. I told him I had been contributing in tangible ways for years, and that the difference was that I had been doing it because I wanted to, not because he'd sent me a bill. And then, because I had waited 63 days since Rosalind was born, Stephanie put my granddaughter in my arms. She has Barbara's nose. I don't know how that's possible, genetics being what they are, but she does. I stood in my daughter's living room holding this 7-pound miracle, and I couldn't hold it together. I didn't try. There are things that didn't resolve neatly. Theron and I are not close. I suspect we never will be. Gwendolyn sent me a card that was so carefully worded it said nothing at all, which I've decided to accept as the closest thing to an apology she's capable of. The monthly transfers have not resumed. The college trust remains in my control. But my daughter calls now. Not every Sunday, we're not back to that yet, but regularly. She came to Columbus last month with Rosalind, just the two of them, and we sat on the back porch where Barbara used to keep her tomato plants, and I watched my granddaughter sleep in the pack and play. I'd bought 3 days earlier at Target, and Stephanie said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm really sorry," and I believed her. I didn't say it was fine. It wasn't fine. I said, "I know you are," and I meant it, and we sat there together until the sun went down. There's a version of this story where I pay the invoice because I'm afraid of losing her. I came close to that version. It would have been easier in the short term. I would have kept the peace and kept my seat at the edge of this family's table and spent the rest of my life wondering what else they'd ask for and whether I'd have the nerve to say no. I'm glad I didn't choose that version. Barbara was the bravest person I've ever known. She stared down a terminal diagnosis with more grace than most people show on their best days. And what she told me in the last weeks, what she said when we were alone and she knew we were running out of time, was, "Don't let them make you small. You're too good a man to be made small by people who can't see your value." I don't know if she could have imagined this particular situation, but I think she would have recognized it, and I think she would have told me to mail the letter. I mailed the letter, and slowly, not all at once, not without pain, but steadily, I got my daughter back. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. I keep thinking about that envelope, the loopy cursive on the outside, the typed invoice on the inside, how both of those things came from the same person. My daughter, the same girl I taught to ride a bike in the church parking lot on a Saturday morning because the street in front of our house had too much traffic. There's a version of me that pays it. I want to be honest about that. The version of me that's terrified of silence, terrified of losing the last piece of Barbara, still walking around on this earth. That version of me writes the check and tells himself it's love. But I've lived long enough to know the difference between love and fear, and most of what would have driven me to pay that invoice was fear. Fear dressed up as generosity. Fear pretending to be a good father. What I've come to understand, slowly and not without cost, is that the way you treat people tells them exactly what you think they're worth. When Theron drafted that invoice and Stephanie signed off on it, they weren't just asking for money, they were telling me my role. They had decided I was a financial instrument with visiting privileges, and they expected me to accept that quietly because I always had before. Every time I wired money without asking questions, every time I drove 11 hours without being invited to stay for dinner, every time I swallowed my discomfort to keep the peace, I was teaching them that this was acceptable, that I would absorb whatever they needed and ask for nothing in return. That's not a relationship. That's a transaction with a sentimental wrapper on it. The hardest thing I've ever done, harder than running a department through 2 recessions, harder than sitting beside Barbara in a hospital room while she made peace with dying, was mailing that letter knowing it might end things with my daughter. That took something I don't have a clean word for, a kind of stubborn clarity about who I am and what I deserve, a refusal to let grief and loneliness turn me into someone who could be billed like a vendor. I had to look at what I built over 63 years, my integrity, my self-respect, the way I'd always tried to do right by people even when it cost me, and decide that those things were worth protecting. Even from my own daughter. I think about what I want Rosalind to know someday. When she's old enough to understand any of this, I want her to know that her grandfather didn't fold. Not because he was stubborn or prideful, but because he understood something that took him a long time to learn. That how you let people treat you is a choice, and that choice has consequences that ripple outward further than you can see. The way I responded to that invoice, carefully, without cruelty, but without capitulation, is the thing I'm most proud of in the last decade of my life. More than any promotion, more than any retirement account balance. Barbara used to say the character isn't what you do when things are easy. It's what you do when the cost is real. The cost was real. I paid it. And on the other side of it, I found my daughter again. Not the managed, curated version, but the actual one, sitting on my back porch apologizing in the way only people who mean it can apologize. That's what I want Rosalind to grow up seeing, that her family tells the truth, that we don't collapse when the truth is hard, that love without honesty isn't love, it's just convenience, and convenience runs out. I still have the invoice in a drawer somewhere. I'm not sure why I kept it. Maybe because it reminds me of the moment I decided to stop being small. And I think Barbara would have kept it too, for exactly the same reason.